He never read it. He spent 3 years wishing he had. The letter sat on his desk for 9 days before he swept it into the fire. She had written it in the kitchen of a house that was no longer hers, and in it she had told him the only true thing anyone had ever tried to tell him. The letter arrived at West Hallow Park on a Tuesday in November of 1811, carried by a boy of perhaps 14 who had walked 4 miles through a rain that had not paused since dawn and showed no inclination toward mercy. The boy stood at the kitchen door, with water running from the brim of his cap and pooling in the cracked leather of his shoes, and he held the letter out with both hands, the way a person holds something that matters to someone else. And the cook's assistant, a man whose name history has not troubled itself to preserve, looked at the boy, looked at the rain, looked at the letter, and shut the door. No cup of water, no word of thanks, not even the courtesy of a reason. The door simply closed, the way doors close in houses where the people inside have forgotten that the people outside are people at all. The letter made it upstairs anyway. Letters do in great houses. They migrate through the hierarchy like birds following warmth, passed from hand to hand until they reach the desk of someone whose name is carved above the front entrance. And the desk it reached belonged to Lord Benedict Olcott, 6th Duke of West Hallow, who occupied 3 rooms of a house that contained 40. Now let's talk about that house, because a house tells you everything a man will not say about himself. West Hallow Park sat on 11,000 acres in the west of England, and it earned, or rather it extracted, £14,000 a year from tenants, timber, and the sheer stubborn fertility of soil that did not care who owned it. 40 rooms. 40. Bedchambers with silk hangings that had not felt the warmth of a sleeping body in a decade. A ballroom whose chandeliers had not been lit since the century turned. A nursery, but we will not speak of the nursery, because Benedict did not speak of it either, and a man's silences deserve the same respect as his confessions. He used the study, the bedroom, and the library. 3 rooms. The rest of the house stood around him like a theatre after the audience has gone. All that architecture, all that intention, all that space designed for the specific purpose of holding human life. And the only life it held was a man who had made solitude into a discipline, the way other men make disciplines of drink or prayer. Benedict was 33. Tall, 6'1", broad-shouldered, lean in the way of a man who rides hard and eats without interest. His eyes were a cold, pale blue, edging toward grey, the colour of a sky that has decided against snow but will not commit to clearing. A strong, square jaw, a barely visible cleft in his chin, 3 faint freckles on his right cheekbone near the ear, which no one had been close enough to notice in years, and on his right hand a heavy gold signet ring, bearing a crest so worn the lion on it had lost most of its face. He turned it with his left thumb when he was agitated, which was more often than anyone knew, because Benedict had trained his body to betray nothing, the way a soldier trains his hands to load a rifle in the dark. The wound was his mother's. Not her death, her departure, which was worse, because the dead at least have the decency to stay where you put your grief for them. Lady Catherine Olcott had forged letters in her son's name, his hand, his seal, to extract £6,000 from a creditor who trusted the Olcott word because the Olcott word had been good for 200 years. She took the money. She took a portrait painter named Devereux, whose talent was mediocre and whose jawline was not. And she left for the continent without a note, without a warning, without the basic human courtesy of a lie told to his face. Benedict was 19. He faced the debt alone. He faced the scandal alone. And he made a discovery that would shape every year that followed. Every tender word his mother had ever written him, every birthday letter, every note slipped under his door when he was ill, every line that said, "My darling boy, my heart, my proudest joy," was in the same hand as the forgeries, the same loops, the same pressure, the same ink. He could not tell which letters had been love and which had been practice. So he learned the lesson the wound taught him, and the lesson was this: written words from women are instruments of extraction. A pen in a woman's hand is a lockpick. An envelope is a warning. And tenderness on paper is simply theft that has not yet been discovered. This is the soil the letter landed in. Poole, his secretary, a man of 50 years' quiet service, whose loyalty had outlasted every scandal. Poole noted the envelope with professional disinterest and set it on the desk. "Plain hand," he observed. "No family seal. A Miss Eleanor Wynne of Hartfield." Benedict did not recognize the name. He set the letter on the corner of his desk, beneath a volume of Tacitus, and did not think of it again for 9 days. He should have thought of it sooner. He should have thought of it immediately. Because 6 weeks before that letter arrived, Benedict had been caught in a storm on the road outside Hartfield, travelling incognito in a plain coat, because even a duke sometimes wants to move through the world without the world rearranging itself around him. He had stopped at a roadside cottage, and a woman, chestnut hair in a practical low knot, grey-green eyes, a small brass thimble on a cord around her left wrist, had fed him bread and broth without asking his name, had mended a tear in his coat sleeve with stitches so fine he could barely find the seam, had sent him on his way with a jar of honey from her own hives, and a nod that expected nothing. He left 2 sovereigns on the table. She ran after him in the rain, to press them back into his palm. Her hand had been warm. The coins had been warm from her hand. He had not stopped thinking about the honey, the bread, the sleeve, or the 2 sovereigns sitting in his palm for 6 weeks. And he still did not connect the name on the letter to the woman at the cottage. He told Poole to burn it. Burn anything else that arrives from that name. Poole hesitated. The letter hung in his hand for 1 breath, 2, and then he fed it to the fire. Benedict turned the signet ring on his right hand, the worn lion pressing into his thumb, and watched the paper curl and blacken in the grate. The narrator notes only this: fire is not an opinion. It does not care what it destroys. And the Duke had been given a door, and he mistook it for a wall. 18 months pass. Benedict has not thought of the letter, or so he has told himself, but he has thought of the honey jar, the bread, the mended sleeve, and the 2 gold coins returned in the rain, approximately 400 times. He has thought of them at breakfast, when the toast arrives dry and perfect and untouched by any hand that might have cared whether he was hungry. He has thought of them in the study, when the fire burns low and no one crosses the room to mend it without being summoned. He has thought of them in the particular silence of 3 o'clock in the morning, when Westhallow settles into its bones and the only sound is the signet ring turning, turning, turning against his thumb. That heavy gold crest, worn nearly smooth now, though he would die before admitting why. And then, 4 days before Christmas in the year of our Lord 1812, the front doors of Westhallow Park open without invitation, without announcement, without so much as a card left on the tray, and Mrs. Honoria Pace walks in. She is 5 feet and 1 inch of black silk and burgundy wool, silver white hair pinned in a coil so tight it could stop a musket ball, gold-rimmed spectacles perched low on a nose that could cut glass. 74 years old, an ivory-handled walking stick with a silver ferrule that strikes the marble floor of the entrance hall like a judge's gavel. Each step a sentence, each pause a verdict. She has not visited Westhallow in 6 years. She has not written to explain why she is visiting now. When the butler, a man of considerable composure, asks whether he should prepare a room, she looks at him over those spectacles and says, "You have 40 empty beds in this house, Mr. Hale. I require 1. Surprise me." A line like that does not require a response. It requires obedience. Mrs. Honoria Pace is Benedict's great-aunt by marriage, his grandfather's second wife's younger sister, a woman who attended the old Duke's funeral with dry eyes and a flask of excellent brandy, and told the mourners that grief was a private matter, and she would thank them to stop performing theirs. She has come because she heard something that displeased her. And when Honoria Pace is displeased, geography is no obstacle. She travelled 93 miles in December in a hired coach with a hot brick and a temper, and she has not come to admire the holly. Now, before we sit down to dinner, let me tell you about the man she has come to discuss, though he will not be at the table. Mr. Alistair Graves, age 40, average height, soft-bodied, rounded shoulders, thinning, sandy blonde hair combed with visible care over a receding hairline, flat, hazel-brown eyes, a round face with a weak chin and small, even teeth that are always, always visible. Because Alistair Graves smiles the way other men breathe, constantly, automatically, without any connection to what is actually happening behind it. He carries a leather document case with brass clasps under his left arm, like a physician carries his bag, and he uses it for roughly the same purpose: to open you up and show you what you owe. He is a man of new money, mercantile family. Nothing wrong with that, except everything is wrong with how he spends it. For 3 years, Graves has been buying up small holdings around Hartfield Parish by purchasing old debts. Some of them decades old, some of them half forgotten, some of them owed by people who died owing them, and pressing the current holders, pleasantly, patiently, relentlessly, until they hand over their deeds. He does not threaten. He does not raise his voice. He leans forward with that tilted head, spreads those soft hands in a gesture of perfect reasonableness, and explains that he is only asking for what is fair, what is legal, what is owed. 14 properties in 3 years. 14 families walked off land their grandparents cleared. And every single time, Graves smiled like he was doing them a favor. Son of a bitch never even had to get his shoes dirty. Christmas dinner at West Hallow is set for 12. 12 places, 12 settings of silver, 12 chairs drawn to a table that could seat 30. 2 of them are occupied. Benedict sits at the head. Mrs. Pace sits at his right, close enough that her cane can reach his ankle if she finds his answers insufficient. The candles burn. The beef is carved. The room is so quiet that the sound of Honoria Pace setting down her wineglass registers like a gunshot. She asks him, casually, the way a surgeon asks you to look at the ceiling before the knife comes down, whether he received any correspondence from Hartfield in the autumn of 1811. Benedict does not look up from his plate. He says he receives a great deal of correspondence. Mrs. Pace says she did not ask about a great deal. She asked about one letter, from one woman, written at a kitchen table in a house she was about to lose. Benedict goes still. Not dramatically, not the way a man goes still in a novel, with a gasp and a dropped fork. He goes still the way a man goes still when he already knows. The signet ring turns once under his left thumb, his pale blue eyes, cold and grey at the edges, fix on a point somewhere beyond the candelabra. He asks, what woman? And Honoria Pace, dark eyes sharp as flint behind those gold-rimmed spectacles, beauty mark like a period at the end of her jaw, tells him. Eleanor Wynne, beekeeper, seamstress, daughter of a dead schoolmaster named Thomas Wynne, who left her a cottage and 12 hives and nothing else in this world. The woman who fed a stranger bread and honey in a storm and sent back his gold in the rain because she had not asked for it and would not be paid for decency. Benedict's hand stops on the ring. Mrs. Pace sets down her teacup with a click that sounds, to Benedict, like a pistol being cocked, and says, "The girl wrote to you, Your Grace. She told you Graves held her cottage on a fraudulent deed, and that she had proof. She asked for nothing but that you, as magistrate of the county, would look at the evidence. You never answered. So she lost the cottage, the bees, the garden, and every stitch she owned. And she walked out of Hartfield with a thimble and her pride, which, I am forced to observe, is more than you deserve to know." He began searching in January of 1813, and he did not stop until March. Let that settle. A duke, a man who could summon Parliament to session, who held 11,000 acres and the loyalty of 600 tenants, spent 3 months of an English winter looking for a seamstress who did not want to be found. And the winter did not care about his title. The roads did not care. The mud did not care. The coaching inns and parish clerks and suspicious strangers at crossroads did not care one damn bit that he was Benedict Alcott, Duke of West Hallow, because he had done the one thing that strips a powerful man to his bones. He had gone looking for someone he had wronged, and the world could smell it on him. He sent agents to Hartfield first, professionals, men who knew how to find people who had slipped between the cracks of a county. They came back within a fortnight with a report that read like a small funeral. The cottage, Eleanor's cottage, the one her father had built with his own hands, the one with the kitchen garden and the hive stands and the low stone wall she had mended every spring, was occupied. A Graves tenant lived there now, a man who paid rent to Alistair Graves and touched his cap when Graves rode past. The hives were gone, not moved, not sold as working colonies, sold for timber. Someone had broken apart the careful dovetailed boxes her father had built and carted the wood away for firewood or fencing, and the bees, well, the bees had simply left. The garden was mud, January mud, grey and flat and featureless, the kind of mud that looks like it has never grown anything and never will. The neighbours remembered Eleanor. Of course they did. You don't forget a woman like that. Straight-backed, grey-green eyes, a brass thimble on a cord around her left wrist, the kind of pride that made you stand up straighter just from being near it. But none of them agreed on where she had gone. One woman, a farmer's wife, said she had seen Eleanor on the Annick Road with a single trunk, walking north in the rain. Another said she had heard, second-hand, third-hand, the way gossip dissolves into rumour, that Eleanor had gone south to take in sewing somewhere near York. A third, an older woman who had known Eleanor's father, said flatly that she was dead. None of them were certain. And Benedict, reading these reports in his study at West Hallow Park, understood for the first time what it meant to lose someone who had no reason to leave a trail. So he went himself. He rode through 3 counties in the dead of winter: Northumberland, Durham, Yorkshire. He stopped at coaching inns where the fires were bad and the ale was worse. He visited parish offices where clerks in threadbare coats looked at him, a man in a tailcoat that cost more than their annual salary, a heavy gold signet ring on his right hand that he kept turning with his left thumb, and decided, quietly, professionally, that they had never heard of any Eleanor Wynne. He attended hiring fairs where women lined up in the cold to be inspected like livestock, and he walked along the rows describing her to strangers. Chestnut hair, grey-green eyes, a brass thimble on a cord, a seamstress, a mender, a woman who would not beg. They looked at him, the coat, the boots, the bearing of a man who had never in his life needed to explain himself, and they did not trust him. Why would they? A man like that asking after a woman like that. They had seen this story before. They knew how it ended. So they shook their heads and said nothing, and Benedict, for perhaps the first time in 33 years, learned what it felt like to be disbelieved. To speak the truth and watch it land on closed faces. To be judged not by what he said, but by what he looked like saying it. Good. He had earned every silent door. Now, here is what Eleanor had been doing while the Duke of West Hallow was learning humility on the frozen roads of northern England. After losing the cottage, after Graves's pleasant smile and forged deed and patient, smiling cruelty had stripped her of everything her father had built, she walked 11 miles to the nearest market town. 11 miles in shoes that were already worn through at the sole, with a single trunk that held 2 changes of clothes, a sewing kit, and nothing else. She sold her father's watch for £3. It was worth 8. She knew that. The buyer knew that. But a woman alone with a trunk and no references does not negotiate from strength, and Eleanor Wynne had long ago learned the difference between what a thing is worth and what the world will pay for it. She took a position as a mending woman for a draper in Wooler. The work was steady, the pay was poor. She might have stayed, but the draper's wife accused her of theft, a missing spool of silk thread worth fourpence, and Eleanor, rather than defend herself, rather than kneel and plead and prove her innocence to a woman who had already decided she was guilty, simply gathered her things and left. She would not beg to be believed. Not for fourpence, not for £4,000. That is who she is. She found work at Fenwick Grange, near Olnham, as a seamstress and household mender for a widow named Mrs. Dolby. She was paid £11 a year. She had been there 19 months. She had rebuilt, again from nothing, again without help, again with her back straight and her hands steady and her pride unbroken. Meanwhile, Benedict found graves in Hartfield. And graves, oh graves. Alastair Graves, that soft-bodied, sandy-haired, round-faced monument to well-dressed theft, was pleasant. He offered Benedict tea. He smiled his small, patient smile, the one where his even little teeth showed, and his flat, hazel-brown eyes stayed perfectly still. And he produced the cottage deed as though it were a party trick. A perfectly ordinary document. A signature at the bottom, dated 3 weeks after the death of Eleanor's father. Graves tilted his head, listening, reasonable, spreading his hands in that gesture of his. The old man signed it on his sickbed, Your Grace. Quite willingly. I dare say he was grateful someone would take the burden off his daughter's hands. Benedict looked at the signature. He knew, with the cold, absolute certainty of a man whose own mother had forged documents to seize a trust, that it was false. The hand was too steady, the ink too even. A dying man does not sign his name like a clerk copying a ledger. He said nothing. He left, and riding back through the January dark, the signet ring turning and turning beneath his thumb, he understood at last what Eleanor had tried to tell him, and what his pride had cost her. His agent located her within the week. A record in a parish ledger at Alnham, written in a curate's careful hand. On the 7th day, in the 3rd county, Benedict's man finds a record in a parish ledger. An Eleanor Wynne, seamstress, employed in the household of a Mrs. Dolby at Fenwick Grange, near Alnham. Benedict rides north. He does not bring his title. He does not bring his ring. He brings nothing but the question he should have asked 3 years ago. Fenwick Grange was not a grand house. It was a stone house of 11 rooms on the edge of a moor, with a kitchen garden that someone had loved very much, and a front door that stuck in wet weather, which, in Northumberland, meant it stuck from September to May. Benedict dismounted in the yard on a Tuesday morning in October, wearing a plain brown riding coat he had purchased for 9 shillings at a draper's shop in Alnwick, specifically because it looked like something a man of moderate means might own. The coat fit poorly across his broad shoulders. The boots beneath it, polished black, stitched by a man in London who served 3 earls and a prince, told the truth the coat was trying to hide. He had left the heavy gold signet ring in his saddlebag, wrapped in a handkerchief, and the pale band of skin where it usually sat on his right hand was its own kind of confession, though he did not think of that. He introduced himself only as Mr. Alcott. He asked to speak with the seamstress. Mrs. Dolby answered the door. She was a practical woman of 58, with a square jaw and the particular calm of someone who has buried 2 husbands and decided that very little else in life warrants panic. She looked at his face. She looked at his boots. The boots cost more than her parlour furniture, and she knew it. And he knew she knew it. And neither of them said a word about it. "The seamstress is busy," Mrs. Dolby said. Not rude, not warm, just a stone wall with an apron. He waited. Not in the parlour. He was not offered the parlour. He sat in the kitchen, on a wooden chair beside a scrubbed deal table, and the fire in the grate was low, and the room smelled of boiled oats and dried lavender and honest work. And Benedict Alcott, Duke of Westhallow, master of 47 rooms and £11,000 a year, sat with his hands on his knees and waited, like a man outside a magistrate's office who has been told his case will be heard eventually. He was offered nothing. No tea, no bread. Not out of unkindness. Mrs. Dolby would have fed a beggar at her door without hesitation, but because Eleanor had told her, plainly and some time ago, that she did not wish to see any visitor who would not state his business before crossing the threshold. A rule born from experience. A rule that had Alistair Graves's fingerprints all over it, though Benedict did not know that yet. So he stated his business. He told Mrs. Dolby he had come about a property matter in Hartfield. A cottage, a deed, a wrong that had been done to a woman named Eleanor Wynne, and that he wished to discuss how it might be put right. Mrs. Dolby studied him for a long moment, the kind of look that weighs a man not by his coat or his boots, but by the way he holds still under scrutiny. And then she went upstairs. 3 minutes passed. 4. The fire cracked once and settled. Then Eleanor came to the kitchen door. She stood in the frame of it, with her back straight and her hands at her sides, and the brass thimble on its thin cord caught the low firelight where it hung against her left wrist. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in its practical low knot, secured with the plain brass pin. The dove-grey wool dress was clean and pressed, and mended at the left cuff with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, because Eleanor Wynne mended things the way she did everything else, with a precision that dared you to find the flaw. The faint crescent birthmark near her hairline was half hidden by a loose strand of hair. Her grey-green eyes moved across his face, and something in them shifted. She recognised him. Not as the Duke of Westhallow. She had never known him as the Duke of Westhallow. She recognised him as the man from the storm, the stranger who had come to her door soaked and shaking 3 years ago, whom she had fed bread and broth at her own table, and who had left 2 sovereigns on that table like payment. Like her kindness was a service rendered. Like bread and broth were transactions that required settling, and the settling was his to determine, and the amount was meant to be generous, which made it worse. Because generosity that is not asked for is just power wearing a pleasant face. Her expression did not soften. It hardened. The small dimple on her right cheek, visible only in profile, disappeared entirely as her jaw set. "What do you want?" she said. 4 words, each one a closed gate. Benedict, carefully, more carefully than he had ever spoken to a creditor, a solicitor, a member of Parliament, or a king, explained what he had learned. The letter she had written, the cottage and its forged deed. The way Graves had pressed and pressed with his patient smile and his leather document case and his reasonable voice, until a woman with no protector and no recourse had been crushed out of her own home like a stone pushed from a wall. He said he had come to help. He said the word help as though it were simple. Eleanor's response was not simple. She did not want his help. She had wanted justice 3 years ago from the magistrate of her own county. She had written a letter, one letter, carefully worded, with every relevant date and figure, to the Duke of Westhallow, whose estate held the original deed. That letter was not read. It was not answered. It was not even opened for all she knew. The cottage was gone. The bees were gone. The garden her mother had planted, and her mother's mother before that, gone. And she had built a new life, smaller, harder, entirely her own. Paid for in shillings earned by needle and thread, owing nothing to anyone, beholden to no man's guilt or charity or sudden inconvenient discovery of conscience. She would not have it dismantled by a rich man, arriving 3 years late with clean hands and a poor man's coat that did not fit him. Eleanor sets down the shirt she is mending, threads the needle back into the cloth with a single, precise motion, and says, "I wrote to the Duke of Westhallow once, sir. He did not read my letter. I do not intend to write again, or to speak to anyone who comes on his behalf. Good afternoon." She returns to her sewing. Benedict stands in the doorway of Mrs. Dolby's kitchen, and for the first time in his life, a closed door would have been kinder than an open one. He did not leave Olnham. He took a room at the coaching inn, a room that cost 3 shillings a night and had a mattress that smelled of tallow and regret. And he stayed. 2 weeks. 14 mornings waking to a ceiling stained the colour of old tea, 14 nights listening to the coaches change horses below his window, and not once, not a single time, did Lord Benedict Alcott, Duke of Westhallow, walk the half-mile of rutted lane to Fenwick Grange. He did not send a card. He did not send flowers. He did not dispatch a servant with a carefully worded apology on cream paper, sealed with that heavy gold signet ring he kept turning with his left thumb, like a man working a lock he'd lost the key to. He did nothing that a duke would do, because everything a duke would do had already failed. And for once, in his cold, careful, military straight life, he was paying attention to the lesson. Instead, and this is the part that matters, so lean in, he made himself useful. Not useful the way rich men usually mean it, which is to say he did not throw money at a problem and wait to be thanked. He mended the ostler's fence. Actual labour. His own hands, a borrowed hammer, nails he paid for at the ironmonger's at a penny a dozen. He carried water from the well for the inn's kitchen when the usual boy was down with a fever. He helped the farrier's wife lift a broken axle off the cart that had been sitting lame in the yard for a week because her husband's back had gone and there was no one else. He paid for his room at the local rate, 3 shillings, not a farthing more. And he did not tip. Because tipping, he had learned in the doorway of Mrs. Dolby's kitchen, with Eleanor Wynne's grey-green eyes cutting through him like winter light through cheap glass, is what rich men do to purchase the feeling of generosity without the cost of actual labour. It is the coin you leave so you can walk away believing you were kind. Benedict did not want to walk away believing anything. He wanted to earn the right to stand still. Word reached Eleanor, of course. Alnham was not London. In a village of 93 souls, a tall stranger with pale blue eyes and a square jaw mending a widow's gate hinge was not gossip. It was the entire week's theatre. Mrs. Dolby mentioned it over supper, casual as salt. The ostler's wife mentioned it at the well. Eleanor did not comment. But the brass thimble on its cord around her left wrist caught the light as her hand paused, just once, over the stocking she was darning. She noticed. She simply refused to say so. Then Graves arrived. Mr. Alistair Graves, with his thinning, sandy hair combed over like an apology for itself, his round, soft face, his leather document case with its brass clasps tucked under his left arm, like a weapon he wanted you to believe was a gift. He came to Fenwick Grange on a Tuesday, dismounting from a hired gig with the careful posture of a man who wants to look taller than 5'9" and never quite manages it. He smiled his patient smile, that smile, the one with all those small, even teeth, and he let himself in through the garden gate as though he owned it, which, if his forged deed held, he very nearly did. He sat across from Eleanor at the kitchen table. He told her, pleasantly, that he had heard she'd been making accusations about the deed. He told her, reasonably, that accusations required proof. He reminded her, with his head tilted in that listening posture that made every threat sound like a favour, that her proof had been in a letter that, regrettably, no longer existed. And then he leaned forward, spread his hands in that gesture of infinite reasonableness, and said, "A woman in your position, Miss Wynne, ought to be more careful with her reputation. Reputations are so much harder to mend than fences." He smiled. He left. That son of a bitch knew exactly what he was doing. He pressed on her poverty the way a man presses on a bruise, gently, precisely, watching her face to see where the pain registered. And Eleanor, to her credit, gave him nothing. Not a flinch, not a breath out of rhythm. She sat at that kitchen table after he was gone, with her hands flat on the wood, the same posture, the same table where she had written the letter that Poole burned without reading. And she breathed. Just breathed. Mrs. Dalby brought her tea without being asked, set it down without a word, and went back to the stove. Some kindnesses do not require language. Benedict learned of Graves's visit that evening from the ostler's wife, who had seen the gig and recognised the document case from a previous visit 6 months prior. He did not storm the Grange. He did not ride after Graves and demand satisfaction. He sat on the edge of that tallow-smelling mattress in his 3-shilling room, and he wrote a letter. Not to Eleanor, to Poole, his secretary, the man whose efficient hands had fed her evidence to a fire. He asked Poole to search the estate records for any copy, any notation, any trace of what Eleanor had enclosed. He asked Poole to examine the county land registry for the date of the Wynne deed transfer. He signed it with his full title, His Grace Benedict Alcott, Duke of Westhallow, for the first time in weeks, and the pen pressed hard enough to leave a groove in the paper beneath. Then, because he was learning, he did one more thing. Behind the Grange, half buried in nettles by the woodshed, there was a chair. Oak, spindle-backed, one leg split clean along the grain. He had seen it on one of his walks that never took him to the front door, but somehow always circled the property like a planet that cannot escape its orbit. He carried the chair back to the inn. He mended it with hide glue and a dowel he whittled himself from a scrap of ash. And before dawn, while the village was still dark and the only sound was a single rooster with no sense of timing, he set it on the kitchen step of Fenwick Grange and walked away. He did not attach a note. A note would have made it a transaction. Eleanor finds the mended chair on the step the following morning. She sits in it. It holds. She does not send it back. The narrator notes, this is not forgiveness. It is acknowledgement. It is the first brick, laid on bare ground, of something that does not yet have a name. 3 things happened in the 4th week, and each of them broke something that needed breaking. The first was a letter from Poole. Now, Poole, and you need to understand this about Poole, had served the Alcott family for 50 years. 50 years of correspondence filed, 50 years of invitations catalogued, 50 years of receipts and deeds and marriage contracts sorted into boxes that bore labels written in a hand so precise it looked engraved. Poole did not throw things away. Poole did not lose things. Poole filed. It was not a habit, it was a religion. So when Benedict had written to him, months ago, in a moment of cowardice he would never fully forgive, and instructed him to burn a certain letter and its enclosures, Poole had done exactly half of what was asked. He burned the letter. The enclosures, a copy of the deed transferring the Wynn cottage and land to one Alastair Graves, and a signed statement from the parish clerk of Fenwick confirming that Thomas Wynn had died a full 3 weeks before the date on that deed. Those Poole filed. Because Poole filed everything. The old secretary sent them south to Benedict with a note so dry it could have started a fire on its own. I kept them, Your Grace, because a man who burns evidence sleeps poorly, and I am too old for poor sleep. Benedict read the note twice. He turned the heavy gold signet ring on his right hand, that worn crest, pressed and pressed again by his left thumb until the metal was warm. And he did not smile, but something behind those cold, pale blue eyes shifted like a lock turning. The second thing. Benedict rode to Alnwick the following morning. Not as the Duke of Westhallow, not with outriders, not with livery, not with any announcement of rank. He walked into the county registrar's office in a plain, dark coat, gave his name as Mr. Alcott, and filed a formal challenge to a land transfer dated 14 months prior, pertaining to a cottage and 4 acres in the parish of Fenwick, transferred from one Thomas Wynn, deceased, to one Alastair Graves, solicitor. The registrar was a man named Hewson. Thin, careful, spectacles thicker than Mrs. Pace's. Hewson examined the dates. Hewson examined the signature. Hewson looked up at Benedict over those spectacles with the expression of a man who has seen Graves's patient smile before, who has watched that leather document case with brass clasps appear on desks across 3 parishes, always accompanied by that same tilted head, that same spread of reasonable hands, and who has, perhaps, been waiting, with the quiet fury of a clerk who knows exactly what a forged signature looks like, but has never had the standing to say so, for someone to finally file the damn challenge. Hewson issued a formal inquiry. He stamped it twice. He did not smile either, but there was something in the way he pressed that stamp, hard, precise, final, that suggested satisfaction. The third thing was Graves himself. He came back to Fenwick Grange on a Tuesday, less pleasant this time. The patient smile was thinner. The hazel-brown eyes were flatter. The leather document case sat under his left arm like a weapon he hadn't decided whether to draw. He found Eleanor in the kitchen, her chestnut hair in its low knot, the brass thimble on its cord around her left wrist. her grey-green eyes steady as glass, and he told her, in that voice like honey poured over a blade, that if she persisted in her claims regarding the cottage, he would see her dismissed from Mrs. Dolby's household. He had friends. He was patient. He could make inquiries of his own. A seamstress with no references was a seamstress with no income, and a woman with no income was a woman who learned, eventually, to stop making difficulties. "You have built a pleasant little arrangement here," he said, smiling with those small, even teeth. "It would be a shame to see it disturbed over a misunderstanding about paperwork." A threat dressed up as concern. That was always Graves's trick, making every knife sound like a favour. But here is where Graves miscalculated, because Mrs. Dolby had been listening from the next room. And Mrs. Dolby, 63, iron-spined, possessed of a voice that could cut tin, entered her own kitchen holding an ivory-handled walking stick with a silver ferrule that did not belong to her. It belonged to Mrs. Honoria Pace, who had sent it north by coach with a note pinned to the handle reading, in a hand as sharp as her dark eyes, "Give him hell, Margaret." Mrs. Dolby planted that cane on the flagstones with a crack that made the teacups rattle. "Mr. Graves," she said, "Eleanor is my seamstress. This household is my own. And if you do not leave my kitchen in the next 10 seconds, I will have the ostler remove you by the collar." She meant it. Every syllable landed like a stone dropped into still water. Graves left. His smile, for the first time, did not reach his eyes. That round face with its weak chin looked, for one unguarded moment, like what it actually was. The face of a man who had mistaken other people's silence for permission, and who was only now beginning to understand that the silence was ending. Then Benedict came. He came to Mrs. Dolby's parlour with a letter bearing the county registrar's seal, and he put it into Eleanor's hands, and he told her what it said. The deed was fraudulent. The signature was forged. The cottage and 4 acres reverted to Eleanor Wynne. Graves had no legal claim. The county would prosecute if she wished, or she could simply take back what was hers. Eleanor stood in Mrs. Dolby's parlour holding that letter. The proof that the deed was forged, that her father never signed it, that the cottage was stolen. And she looked at Benedict, who had given her this without asking for anything, and she said, very quietly, "Why?" Benedict said, "Because you fed a stranger in a storm and would not take his money. Because that was the truest thing I had seen in 15 years. And because I owe you a letter." His voice broke on the last word. Not dramatically, just a fracture, a hairline crack in that military straight composure, that squared jaw, those broad shoulders trained to betray nothing. Eleanor's eyes filled, but she did not cry. She nodded once. She folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket, next to the thimble. She has not said yes to anything. She has only stopped saying no. She went back to Hartfield in April, when the blackthorn was blooming and the lanes smelled of wet chalk and green. The cottage stood. That was the first thing. The walls stood. But Graves's tenant had treated the place the way Graves treated everything he touched, which is to say with the casual indifference of a man who understood the price of nothing because he had never paid for anything himself. The roof leaked in 2 places. The garden was mud churned to a grey paste by boots that had no business being there. The hives, her father's hives, the ones she had tended since she was old enough to hold a smoker, were gone. Sold, probably. Burned, possibly. It did not matter. They were gone. Eleanor Wynne stood in the doorway of her own house, the brass thimble on its cord catching the April light at her left wrist, and she did not weep. She had done enough of that. She rolled her sleeves to the elbow, and she began again. 3 new hives. £11 a year she had earned at Fenwick Grange, saved shilling by shilling, coin by coin, in a tin box she kept beneath her bed. She bought the hives herself. She mended the roof herself, with help from 2 neighbour women who remembered her father, and who climbed the ladder without being asked, because that is what people do when they are not performing generosity for an audience. Benedict offered to pay for the repairs. She said no. He offered to send men from West Hallow. She said no. He offered to replace the hives with better ones, imported, Italian stock, the finest in 3 counties. She said no. And she said it the way she said everything. Once, clearly, as though the word had been weighed on a scale and found to be exactly the right weight. Benedict returned to West Hallow. He did not write to her. He waited. And Mrs. Honoria Pace, who had been watching the whole of this disaster unfold from behind her gold-rimmed spectacles, with the serene fury of a woman who had outlived every fool she had ever met, summoned him to her sitting room and told him the truth. You cannot buy her, you cannot rescue her, and you cannot impress her. The ivory-handled cane tapped the floor once, sharp as a period. You can only be worth her time. I suggest you start by learning what that costs. Benedict, turning the worn signet ring on his right hand with his left thumb, asked what it costs. Everything you have used as armour. Mrs. Pace's dark eyes, nearly black, did not blink. Your title, your distance, your certainty that you are owed. She tapped the cane again. Begin. Now, Graves. Let us finish with him the way he deserves to be finished. Not with a bang, not with a dramatic reckoning, but with paperwork. The county registrar's inquiry turned up 14 fraudulent deeds. 14. 14 families whose homes had been stolen by a man with a leather document case and a patient smile. A man who made every threat sound like a favour, who pressed on poverty the way other men press on a bruise, and smiled while he did it. 14 families restored. Graves himself faced prosecution, but fled to the continent, which is, as anyone who has read enough history knows, where people go when England has finished with them. He was not defeated by force. He was made irrelevant. Eleanor's freedom was restored, and Alistair Graves simply had nothing left to hold. Good riddance. The man was a document case with legs. 3 months passed. Benedict did not come to Hartfield. He spent those months learning to mend fences, carry water, and sit in rooms where no one owed him deference. He did not do this gracefully. He did not do it quickly. But he did it, and the doing of it cost him everything. Mrs. Pace said it would. Every inch of distance, every degree of title, every cold certainty that the world was a ledger and he was owed a balance. Then he came to Hartfield, not as the Duke, not as Mr. Alcott. He came as a man in a plain coat with mud on his boots, and he knocked on Eleanor's door. She opened it. The chestnut hair in its low knot, the grey-green eyes steady, the crescent birthmark at her left temple catching the late July light. She looked at him the way she had looked at him the first night, measuring, precise, unwilling to pretend. He asked if she needed a chair mended. She said the chair he mended holds well. He asked if he might sit in it. She considered this for a long time, long enough for the blackbird in the garden to sing twice through its phrase, long enough for the light to shift on the kitchen floor, long enough that the most important decisions revealed themselves to be the ones that refused to be rushed. And she said, yes. The kiss did not happen at the door. It happened weeks later, in the garden, after he had helped her set the new hives, and she had shown him how to smoke the bees, and he had been stung twice on the hand, the right hand, the one with the signet ring, and had not complained. She took that hand and turned it over and pressed her mouth once to his palm, over the sting, and he was, for the first time in this entire story, unable to speak. The proposal was not a proposal. It was a question. "Will you let me stay?" Eleanor said, "I will let you earn it." That is the only honest answer to a question asked by a man who once burned a letter without reading it. Years later, 7 or perhaps 8, the narrator is not certain and does not think it matters, 2 people sit at a kitchen table in a stone cottage with 12 hives in the garden and a mended oak chair by the fire. Their hair is beginning to grey. A brass thimble hangs on a cord from a hook by the door, next to a heavy gold signet ring on a nail. They are reading a letter together, from Mrs. Pace, who is 82 and still furious about something, and the woman laughs, and the man watches her laugh. And this is what happiness looks like when it has been earned by every hard year that preceded it. Not the absence of sorrow, but the presence of someone who stayed. The hard years are not erased. They are simply no longer the whole of the story. And the letter he never read, he carries its absence like a scar he chose not to heal, because it reminds him every morning that the most important words are the ones you almost miss, and that a woman who writes to you from a kitchen table in a house she is about to lose is not asking for charity. She is offering you the chance to be the man you were supposed to be. He was 3 years late, but he arrived.